Well, good morning, Miss Margie.
You sent last night.
Mhm.
Was definitely a team effort. Kaylee did the eviction one all by herself, and I did the statement of needs, but a lot of staff gave input to data and helped edit. So
It was amazing. I want to send that far and wide. Yeah.
I think today Kaylee's working on updating the eviction data. We were going to wait till the end of the month, but considering last night, we want to update it. But some things have changed since the last one. So we've got to unpack that a little bit. And then hopefully today or Monday, we'll get a new one out.
And then you can just give us an okay to share? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So just hold off. I mean, I shared with my peers because we have a work session Monday, and I shared your narrative that said, it's in process here. It's not totally approved, but they need to know those. It's only going to get worse. It's not,
Good morning, Chuck.
Good morning. How's everybody doing?
Hello.
I'm good.
Hi, Ms. Beckman.
Hi, Chuck. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, Diane.
Hey, good morning.
All right. Well, it's now it's 9 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. We're not taking any votes today, but we do have a good agenda to get through. There is the consent agenda with the minutes in it. We're not going to take a vote, but I do want to ask, just for the sake of accuracy. Oh, I think that wasn't included in the packet. That's okay. 1 second. No, that wasn't. Never mind. I was going to ask if anyone had any updates or corrections to the minutes. Never mind. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the section of our meeting. There's a training on federal funding requirements and allowable activities. Kaylee is with us this morning. Good morning, Kaylee. You're going to help us through this.
Yes, hopefully it's pretty complex, but I'll do my best.
Thank you very much.
I'm just going to share my screen.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, Teresa.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So as Duggan said, we're going to talk today about some of the COVID-19 related funding for homelessness assistance. And we're talking specifically today about two separate funds, both of which were authorized by the CARES Act back in March of 2020. The first is the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Edition, or ESGCV. And the second is the Community Development Block Grant, Coronavirus Edition, or CDBG-CV. Both of these funds are more flexible than typical ESG and CDBG programs. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of the programs and their funding requirements and what some of our providers in Pinellas County are doing with these funds. So first off, diving into ESGCV, you can see at the bottom of the screen here with the puzzle pieces that this came out to communities in two different rounds. The first round went out in April 2020 and the second in June 2020. And in Pinellas, we've got about $8.6 million altogether. And I'll go over who has part of that pot in a minute. But generally, all of these funds need to be used by September 30th, 2022, which is coming up pretty quickly. And to date, we have only spent about 6% of these funds. So I would direct your attention to the charts in your packet. I believe it starts on pages 23 to 26. You've got the same information presented two different ways. So on pages 23 and 24, you're looking at all of these funds that I'm about to go over arranged by their ending date. And then on page 25 and 26, we have all the funds that are arranged by their type. So however it makes more sense to your eye, we've got it presented there both ways. So if you have any questions about the next few slides, that's your reference point. So first we have Pinellas County has about $3.4 million in ESGCV to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. Then we have the Department of Children and Families. The HLA actually has a contract with DCF to have some of these funds, and then we're acting as almost a pass-through because we have a contract with Directions for Living to actually provide these services into the community. So this is a few different projects here, but together they equal about $3 million. And the services provided would be rapid rehousing, non-congregate shelter, eviction diversion, targeted prevention, and we also have a workforce development and housing navigation pilot program. So St. Petersburg has so many subrecipients, they get their own slide. Right now they are providing rent and utility assistance through partnerships with Bully Centers and Catholic Charities for about 1.5 million. They are working with Directions for Living, Catholic Charities, St. Vincent de Paul, and CASA to provide rapid rehousing for about 1.3 million. And with St. Vincent de Paul for about 260,000 for hotel vouchers. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the details about how these programs look in practice and what they really mean to our clients. So anyone that's being served with an ESG CV fund has to be below 50% AMI. As you saw in the previous few slides, most of these funds in our community right now are going towards rental assistance. And there's no limit on the amount of rental assistance that we're able to provide. With typical ESGs, this was anywhere from 3 to 24 months, but HUD recently removed the cap completely. So there's no limit on the amount that can be provided to our tenants, as long as the unit meets rent reasonableness standards. Again, with typical ESG, it also has to meet fair market rents, but in this case, it does not. We're also able to offer landlord incentives because units are especially hard to find at this time, especially our affordable units. So right now, under this program, we're allowed to offer up to 3 times the unit's rent, signing bonuses up to 2 times, and extra security deposits and repairs that aren't covered by the typical security deposit. And we can also pay for renter's insurance if it's recovered or required by the lease.
Haley, can I add something here that came up yesterday around rental assistance, since I know we have Arrow and Chuck on the phone and they are meeting with their HUD TA people today or sometime this week. So yesterday on DCF office hours, they always have HUD technical assistance on the call, and they are going to allow under their contract for ESG CV to be used for any jurisdiction. So if we're funded with ESG CV for rental assistance or relocation in some way, and we serve Pinellas County, so normally that would have to be used in Pinellas County. They have waived that and have decided that we can relocate people anywhere in order to utilize those funds. So, and HUD approved that on the call. I would like to get that in writing. I always like to get it in writing, even though the meeting was recorded. But I just wanted to mention that here because that could open up a lot of opportunity if jurisdictions also allowed that flexibility when maybe it wasn't previously allowed. So I'm going to check into it more, but I did want to mention that as breaking news yesterday, anyway, to us that we thought could be really helpful information. That was it. Thanks, Haley.
Okay, so a few other ways that our ESG CV dollars are currently being used in Pinellas County. We've got the eviction diversion program. This is where our legal aid societies like Community Law, Gulf Coast Legal, and Bay Area Legal Services are working with tenants to avoid having an eviction on their record. We know that sometimes landlords screen for previous evictions for up to 10 years ago. And so anything we can do to spare people from having an eviction will enable them to access other housing opportunities in the future. We also have the Targeted Homeless Prevention Program. This is run through Directions for Living with those pass-through dollars from the HLA. And this is for those 5 zip codes that you see on your screen. These zip codes were chosen because of their disparate impact from COVID-19. Then we have utility assistance. We can pay for gas, electric, water, and sewage bills for up to 24 months and arrears for all of those services for up to 6 months. We can also pay for case management services with ESGCV dollars. This is for our people that are in rapid rehousing. There is no monthly meeting requirement like typical ESG, but a case plan is still required. We can also cover housing stability case management. This is different because this is for our folks that are currently in shelter. These services under regular ESG were only allowable for 30 days, but HUD recently in that July waiver increased this to 60 days. We can also pay for hotel motel costs. There are a handful of providers around the county paying for hotel motel costs. And this not only covers the night of the stay, but can also cover extra cleaning and repair fees. And then finally, we have folks using these dollars for storage unit costs and moving expenses to help our clients transition into their new residence. So this list here, these are all very new allowances from HUD. So to our knowledge, these are not being currently provided by anyone in Pinellas County. But according to HUD, as of last month, these services are all technically eligible to be provided under ESGCV. So the first is COVID-19 testing. This can be kind of billed under ESGCV in two ways. The first would be through street outreach. And if it's billed under that, the testing has to take place in a public site, like a park or a parking lot. Or it could be billed under the shelter component. And in this case, the testing has to take place at the shelter. So you would have to have someone come to the facility. We can also pay for cell phones and cell phone services. These need to be returned to the provider after the client exits the program. Vaccine incentives, we can pay for up to $50 cash per dose. Furniture and home furnishings, again, we're still asking for clarification from HUD on this, but we currently believe that all of the furniture and furnishings has to be returned to the provider once the client exits the program. And laundry services. So this can pay for laundry for our clients in shelter, rapid rehousing, and even our unsheltered folks. If we wanted to have a laundry truck go out to an encampment, we could help some of those folks with laundry as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause there before I move on to CDBG. Does anyone have any questions about ESGCV?
Just a quick question. You've named some other uses for the funding and indicated that, you know, currently that's not being done in Pinellas County. Is there a move or a desire to offer some of these things, or do we think we should? Is there a need? I'm just wondering what we might be hearing about going for these allowable uses that we're not currently using funds for.
I think, you know, Duggan, after the executive committee had some discussion around vaccines and testing, we brought that to emergency shelter leaders and they were pretty quiet about it. I think, you know, testing right now is readily available, and so that's less of a need. Incentives is interesting to folks. I calculated, I think it would come at a cost to the community if we could get everybody vaccinated of about $150,000 if we did the incentives. The challenge we're trying to work through is the health department thinks there's challenges around tracking that. We are not required to, we can enter it in HMIS, but we can't require that someone give us that information. And right now, one of the challenges DCF is working through in particular is how would we give the incentive, right? We can't give gift cards. That's not allowable by DCF. And so, you know, we're not going to give out cash. And so what would that look like? So that's one of the things we're trying to work through. I can tell you that some providers have brought up the need for cell phones and cell phone services, and that's especially important when we are trying to rehouse people. They need to be able to have a phone, and they also need to have a phone in order to apply for ERA and jobs and all those other things. So out of this list, I would say that's kind of the current conversation that's happened in other committees.
Okay. Along the line of the vaccine incentives, I mean, maybe one solution, and a provider might have come up with this, transportation is always a challenge. So, I mean, an agency could have sort of a corporate Uber account where they could like load up a certain amount of money, and that would be available to someone for transportation, perhaps. And that's a way that's not giving a gift card, I guess, but meets a need and can be monitored and tracked. And then maybe it, you know, a lot of times organizations that have done that before, it's about getting to medical appointments and helping people meet those needs. But maybe along the line of it being an incentive, it's you don't have to use it for medical. You could use it for other things. But it's still, it wouldn't be giving people cash, and it could be monitored by an agency. And that sort of gets along with the COVID-19 testing as well. Although there is access to testing right now, I'm wondering if transportation is a challenge for our various providers, and if, you know, under this funding, it would allow for, you know, payment of someone. You know, we retrofitted vans with safety shields and all of that at the beginning of COVID. I wonder, you know, if we rent those from an agency that has it to move people to testing sites. I wouldn't necessarily want to put someone who might be positive in an Uber. But if we've got vans and transportation, I wonder if some of this funding could be used to, you know, if that falls under the testing. I don't know how broad the allowable is under testing, if transportation to testing would be included, especially for homeless service providers.
That's definitely something we can check into. We do, our Department of Health has been such a great partner, I have to say, after being on that call yesterday. And there was a specific COVID focus with HUD TA around COVID. Many other communities in Florida are not as lucky as we are in Pinellas County to have such great partnerships. So I just have to say that out loud. I was really sobered by the challenges that other communities are having and not even being able to develop a relationship around some of these needs.
For sure. Okay. Thank you very much.
Hey,
Hannah.
Duggan,
Yeah.
this is April. I just wanted to say about some of these, like, for example, the cell phones and cell phone services. We have not used ESG funds yet for this. Some of these things that have been discussed by Kaylee would require budget amendments, which, you know, we are trying to navigate through and work through because it's not what the original proposal or the original budget, or even what the original communities, if we're talking about, you know, county or St. Pete or whatever, we're willing to use the funds for. So it's going to require some budget amendments, which, you know, HLA, Amy in particular, is helping us to try to navigate. But I just want to say about the cell phones and cell phone services, it is a tremendous need. However, the idea that they have to be, you know, given back. So they're issued to a client who's homeless or housing unstable, and then they have to be given back. The tracking, the cost of tracking, distribution, getting them back, all these things, it turns out that it's almost more expensive than actual, like, the phones. And so the administrative burden of some of these things is not allowable in expenses. So just know that as we talk through some of these things operationally, they are very, very difficult to do some of them administratively when you don't have administrative funds.
Yeah.
This is
I get it.
Carol. I of course, all these ancillary things are important, but it sounds, I'd like to know a little bit more. If 6% of the funds are out, where are the blockages? And I would think that we'd probably be better figuring out how to free those blockages to get the funds for all these bigger types of programs and stuff like that to help them get out. I also suspect that just like local governments are seeing, that all of our nonprofits are probably having a really hard time keeping staff and finding people to fill positions, which might be part of the blockage. And so that might be something as funders that we need to look at, if there's any way to help expand the cost or relook at the cost or something like that, like a COVID plus 10% or 15% or something for some of these service contracts, just to allow them to help fill those positions. I don't know if that's something that could be done, but
I
or if
can't
that's a need.
speak to that, Arrow, from HUD's perspective anyway. They are highly recommending that every agency that has ESG CV funding provide staff hazard pay. They are very focused on getting this money out. And as you can see, even in our community, we've only spent 6%, and that in order to get it out, it takes staff. And so that means, we may need to look at creative solutions for getting staff hired, as well as keeping them, because many of us are seeing a churn.
Thank you. To Arrow's point, I guess, before we leave the ESG CV, beyond what might have been mentioned about staff, what are some of our known blockages to getting funding spent on the purposes of the funds? So if there's anything beyond sort of what you mentioned, Amy, about addressing a hazard pay issue, or trying to assist in doing something to make the hiring or retention more attractive, what are the known blockages at the moment?
I can answer from our perspective. I'd be interested in hearing from funders on this, because they have all the contracts and likely know more. But what we hear from providers and what we see ourselves is, and this is true with ERA, this is true with everything, is documentation is especially challenging. And, the other thing I would say is staff turnover matters. And so that hiring up, getting things up to speed fast enough is challenging, as well as retaining staff in positions. And then on the other end, from the funder end, I know some funders have struggled with, they didn't get dollars or more positions to push all of this out. And so their ability to process things quickly is also challenging. But I'd lean on the funders to share what they're hearing, but that's kind of the summary of what we hear.
Thank you.
Amy, this is Chuck. I completely agree with what you just said. That it's all about capacity, and it's about the providers having the capacity to administer the services. That these funds are burdensome. There's a lot of documentation. There's a lot of stuff. It's not, these funding sources don't make it easy, but it's a matter of capacity. It's on the funder side too. It's about coordinating these agreements and getting these agreements out the door. It's about the providers building capacity to be able to move the money. The money's out there. You can see it. It's capacity on both ends. That's been my experience throughout this whole thing.
Chuck, when you say capacity, are you talking staffing capacity to manage the funds themselves and the compliance requirements? What part of capacity, or what do you see more specifically from a capacity issue is the challenge?
I mean, on the funder side, it's definitely the compliance, and it's making sure everything's in order. I think on the funder side, it's a capacity issue of being able to put out the services that you can put out. So I think it's different on both sides. But yeah,
Okay.
there's a capacity issue on the funder side. It's when we ran a rent services program, emergency rent program in the fall with CRF money, we did not assist one single person that did not need one-on-one help in just completing an application. I mean, that's incredibly staff intensive. And that's really more of a provider side of things. We administered that program ourselves. So, we had a firsthand knowledge at what it takes on the provider side to get this thing done. But now we're trying to stick to just the funding, and even that's difficult to really keep up with the compliance side. So.
Thank you.
Duggan, I did. Oh, sorry, Joe, go ahead.
With the county, I think as a follow-up to both Amy and Chuck, each time we've gotten an application or discussed providing the ESGCV or the CDBG-CV, we need $250,000 worth of services, but it comes with 5 or 6 new people to carry out those on the agency side. And finding those people and trying to get them in place to be able to carry out the services and everything has been a big blockage. Again, we need $1 million worth of funding to meet these needs, but I'm going to have to go hire 10 or 15 folks to help me carry out that $1 million worth of needs. And I think that's, again, that's a big issue that we're seeing as well.
Thank you.
I had a question before we leave this ESG CV, if I could. And I think it's going to echo everybody's concerns about staffing, but the HUD allowing these funds to be used in any jurisdiction for rental assistance and relocation, that we can relocate them out of the county. So that sounds real promising because we don't have enough affordable housing here. Does that mean even out of the state? And I would anticipate that's pretty labor intensive to make sure, make sure it works. Right?
Yeah. So Kathleen, one of the things I said to a CFO who had called me yesterday, which is why I said I want it in writing, is the example they used was relocating someone to Canada and said that would have been allowable if the borders weren't closed. So I don't know if they were making a joke. So again, I'm going to follow up and get it in writing. And I'm not sure how we would help someone relocate out the state except for traveler's aid. But it's a good question. And that's why I want to kind of follow up and, what are the allowables under that? I did put in the chat, I'll just mention real quick, it applies to both the ESG CV and CDBG CV. There was significant talk when we moved from CARES funding to these as well as ERA, that we have local providers that can provide quality services, but they do not have the financial capital to float significant amounts of financial resources. So, that is another challenge, that these are reimbursement based. And, you have to wait for that. And many providers, are using every credit resource they have. I can tell you there is an allowable way to do advances. We have asked DCF for an advance. We have not received it yet. But for the ESG CV funds, I know DCF is doing it, so that might be another thing that governments can look at.
And we, and I'll tell you, when we did our CARES funding, we did advances to certain agencies on the basis, we used specific federal guidance to do that. We had a process put in place to do that. And so it is possible. I do know that it is from a local government standpoint, it's often not the way that business is done. But if cash flow is a holdup, I think many of the agencies the larger agencies that usually are the provider in these situations generally have a federal single audit from our view, now this is, we were looking at things 6, 9, and 12 months ago, so you'd have to see what's going on now. But the vast majority of those providers had a clean federal single audit. And so I think that, it would be helpful for there to be some examination of the possibility of advance funds in if certain criteria is met. Because providers, especially when you're sort of like shoving out this much money, they can only go so far, and there is really only so much credit that they can get. And although it is inexpensive relatively to borrow money, it still is an expense an agency needs to bear. I would ask that, locally, we really seriously take a look at when and how quickly we can make advances available to appropriate agencies.
Okay, if we're ready to move on, we'll get back into CDBG CV.
Thank you.
So this came to our community in 3 different rounds. The first in April 2020, then the second in May, and the third in September 2020. Altogether in Pinellas, we're looking at about $5.5 million that needs to be spent. The deadlines vary, and again, you can refer to your chart for more details on that. Some of them expire in September 2022. Some of the other larger pots are available through July 2026, which is great. But to date, we have only spent about 15%. So who has some of these funds? We could be missing people. It's very possible that there are subrecipients and things like that that we don't know about. So I will note that if you know of a subcontract that you are working with that you don't see on the chart, please reach out and let us know so that we can kind of get our numbers up to date. But so the first fund that we do know about for CDBG CV funding is the City of Clearwater, and they have a subcontract with Suncoast Housing Connection for about $1 million to provide mortgage and utility assistance. Then we have Largo with about $660,000 for eviction prevention, financial counseling, and economic stability case management. Pinellas Park has about $75,000 for homeless outreach, and Pinellas County has about $3.4 million to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID. And again, St. Pete has many subrecipients. They are currently using their CDBG CV funds to work with WestCare and St. Vincent de Paul for operating funds, the HLA and Gulf Coast Legal for legal aid and eviction diversion services, and Catholic Charities and Boley Centers for mortgage, rent, and utility assistance. Okay, so talking about what these CDBG CV programs kind of look like to our clients. So participant income must be below 80% AMI. You'll note that is higher than ESG CV. So these funds are a bit more flexible. They can pay for rental and mortgage assistance for past, current, and future costs, utility costs for up to 3 consecutive months, and legal services, which might include representation of tenants, some walk-in legal counseling, and foreclosure mitigation. So we only have one thing that's allowable under CDBG CV that to our knowledge is not currently being provided in Pinellas County, but it is a big and important one. And this would be hotel motel acquisition. So these funds allow you to buy a hotel and convert it to emergency shelter. And then the emergency shelter could continue to be converted to permanent supportive housing, or it could stay as an emergency shelter. So next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of different communities that have acquired hotels and some of the lessons they learned in converting those.
Kaylee, can I ask you real quick, when you talk about the conversion from emergency shelter, you said to permanent supportive housing, can that also be converted to permanent housing, as in, without supportive services there? That may or may not be a good idea, but in essence, making affordable housing available maybe through smaller units, or does it have to absolutely be permanent supportive housing that it gets converted to?
Avery, jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that it does have to have those services attached to it. So yeah, the slide is missing a word. But
As of right now, what we're seeing, yes, But it's going to be interesting to see how California and those projects progress
Okay.
and see what they do allow in the future.
Okay.
California, North Carolina, they're having really good success with this. So it's going to be interesting to keep watching it, Duggan.
Sure, because I know we have and when we continue to see it, a major shortfall in the number of permanent supportive housing units that are available. But I also know that part of the challenge in that in any time is not only, the money for acquisition is one thing, but the continuing money and the availability of money for services is often a challenge. Not that I'd advocate not having permanent supportive housing, but wouldn't want us to get into a situation where we couldn't continue to sustain the staffing that's necessary.
Absolutely. Okay, so before I get into those case studies, I just have one more slide here about some other funds that are making a big impact in our community. Pinellas County and St. Pete both have emergency rental assistance funds. The county has about 7.8 million, and this is about 37% spent to date. And St. Pete has 3.3 million, which is about 42% spent to date. So you can see that these spend downs are much more on track than a lot of our other funds, which is a great sign. The city, I'll also mention, has about $180,000 in SHIP funds that are need to be expended by June 30th, 2022. Okay, so now some case studies from around the country and how other people are using these dollars. So a lot of these programs were funded with CDBG CV. You'll see some of them have philanthropic funding, some of them have other various state and federal sources. As I said earlier, these types of projects could be paid for with CDBG CV, but they could also be paid for with American Rescue Plan dollars, which we didn't go into detail on today, but those are significant pots of money that are coming to our community. Clearwater has about $1.6 million in rescue plan money, St. Pete, $3 million, and Pinellas, $4.8 million that could be paired with CDBG CV and maybe some other funds as well to carry out some of these projects. So our first example is out of California. It's called Project Home Key, and it's being administered by the California Housing and Community Development Department. They have about $846 million in federal, state, and philanthropic funding. And they required all of their applicants, and their applicants could be municipalities, they could be nonprofit developers, to have a development team. So they wanted people working together. So providers, as well as developers, even partnering up with the COC to truly understand the need. They also required a local match if the cost per unit exceeded $100,000. So since the start of this project, which was, really only a few years ago, March 2020, these projects have been very successful. Project Home Key was able to produce 6,000 new units across 95 projects in 51 different communities. They did this by taking all of their applications and sorting them into 2 tiers, and they were funded on a first come, first served basis if all of their requirements were met. So all the tier 1 projects were places that were able to be occupied in 90 days. So this could be a hotel motel that really didn't need a lot of work in order to serve as a shelter. All of these projects were funded because they recognized that while permanent supportive housing is important, right now, especially during the pandemic, emergency non-congregate shelter is just as important. The remaining projects were put in tier 2. Most were funded, but some were waitlisted as they're trying to expand this program. These were all of the projects that were not able to be occupied within that 90-day time period. Very similar project with a similar name as well, Project Turnkey out of Oregon. They were working with about $71 million, and they set aside 30 of that specifically for 8 different counties that were impacted by the wildfires. So they're targeting their specific needs right out the gate with that. This program is administered by the Oregon Community Foundation. who is working with 2 real estate development consultants to do all of their due diligence and looking into all the properties, negotiating, and all those types of things. The Community Foundation also helped to assemble an advisory committee to review the applications, and they offered $5,000 mini grants to anyone's agency who sat on the advisory committee as kind of like a thank you for taking part in that work. They use a multi-phase competitive grant process, and they reviewed the applications on a rolling basis, and they assessed everything for how this would have an impact on the local COVID rates, the regional rates of homelessness, and current shelter capacity. They looked at it with an equity lens and thought about how these projects could support the community with accessibility to closer amenities like grocery stores and public transit. So from the start of this program, they have been able to secure 867 new units in 19 different projects across 13 counties. Our third example here is out of Vermont. This is a much smaller state, and so they've got much smaller projects. This one operated a little bit differently. They had about $33 million to start with, and it's being administered by the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. They have, this board has existing administrative capacity and partnerships with local and state agencies. They're familiar with this work. They've reviewed applications like this, so they decided to keep it all centralized. And they do cite that as one of their key success factors. So they didn't do a typical application process like the others. They asked for letters of interest and then followed up with people by asking for full applications and explanations of their projects. And they obviously acquired and converted hotels and motels, but they also used them for a few different uses as well. So they made safety and capacity improvements at 12 different shelters. So these were things like, you know, further spacing out at a shelter, plexiglass dividers, things like that. They also built some manufactured homes on empty lots in one of their smallest counties where the population is only 9,000. They just built one tiny home on one lot. And they also acquired another motel for a quarantine site for individuals currently affected with COVID. So throughout that program, they secured 247 new units across 13 projects in 13 different communities. And our last example today is from Minnesota. This is Hennepin County. They had about $25 million to spend. The county was actually in a great position when COVID hit because they recently experienced a fire at one of their largest shelters. And so they had to quickly scrap together a plan to deal with a large number of newly unsheltered folks. So their county board was very comfortable with this idea of acquiring motels already. And so they were able to kind of jump right in once COVID hit and they had this new allowance of dollars. So this program is being administered by the County Housing and Redevelopment Authority. The county actually owns all of the properties, but they have signed leases and management agreements with others to actually operate the buildings. Since it is run by the county and owned by the county, obviously all purchases were subject to approval by the county board. And the Housing and Redevelopment Authority provided guidance to the county on what they should be looking for. And they decided that the properties that would be most successful for them would be those with fewer than 130 rooms, places that had good access to public transit and shopping centers, and places that were already near other residential areas. So they had 4 different hotels that were converted in the county to produce 165 new non-congregate shelter units. These are currently being used to shelter homeless older adults and people with pre-existing conditions throughout the pandemic. They've converted 31 of them so far to permanent supportive housing, and the remainder is scheduled for conversion in mid-2022. So some of the lessons learned from these projects, again, they're very new. So all of the information is kind of still forthcoming. We're gonna see how many units were able to be converted in the course of 5 years. So it's kind of a work in progress, but it's interesting to look at these examples because it does kind of get the gears going about what we could do with all of the new money coming to our community. So some of the lessons learned from these projects that they recommend thinking about if you're planning any projects like these would be to partner with other agencies that already have capacity and expertise in these areas. That way your program will run more efficiently and increase access to different services that are needed by those clients. They also really emphasize planning of the program with an equity lens, and this can be everything from the application timeline. So are you giving those smaller communities which maybe don't have as much free time or access to technology, are you giving them an ample time to apply? It can go all the way up to who we're letting stay in these shelter units? How are we screening them? They also suggested creating a diversity of permanent affordable housing types. So we know sometimes we've got families, sometimes we have families with disabilities. There are a lot of different needs. So use your data and make sure that what you're building is actually going to suit the needs of the community. They also recommended providing technical assistance through a centralized place. And they found that this was especially valuable when the technical assistance was in regards to other funding sources that could be paired with the CDBG-CV or the American Rescue Plan dollars to help these projects come to completion. Avoiding areas with known remediation issues and planning for ongoing operating support. So again, once these program dollars are built or are spent and these hotels have been converted, what's going to pay for the ongoing services? It's important to have a plan for that in place before clients are placed in the units. Okay. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Kaylee. This has been really a great presentation today and a lot of really helpful information shared, great ideas too. So let's go ahead and see what comments and questions folks have for Kaylee and for all of us, I suppose.
This is Arrow. It seems like we have a really good opportunity, especially potentially with ARPA funding, to look for ways that we could create almost a consortium of funding for some bigger initiatives. I think that from what I've heard, some of the jurisdictions met the other day to talk about creating a workforce training consortium with some of the ARPA monies, looking at manufacturing skills training and things like that. So I wonder if there'd be, potential to have a consortium where we could compile some of the funding to invest in some of these bigger projects like this and have that kind of united board that's reviewing for, projects that could be done in the short term as well.
It's I think that's a great idea, Arrow. At the moment, I think there's one thing that would maybe be helpful is there are a variety of affordable housing groups, teams, task forces in different places that maybe some of that could be brought together as one. I think we all know, and we have tried to focus on the fact that housing is the answer to homelessness. It's not necessarily more shelter space, but really addressing housing issues and the issues faced by individuals and families, and obtaining and maintaining housing is how we're going to get out of our homeless issue. And so maybe it's time to see what we can do to combine the forces of a variety of groups that are out there trying to do good work, but doing it separately.
I think a countywide approach is always the best approach. I mean, jurisdictional lines, they're just restrictions that are really arbitrary to the issue at hand. So if there is a way to coordinate that, I mean, I would certainly support that. And then on the other end, we got to find the right ways to spend the money. We got to find opportunities, to make these financial investments.
two other things with that. So I had mentioned in the notes too, potentially pulling in our code enforcement groups because they are very knowledgeable about what's available and open and vacant throughout the community on a regular basis, along with what might be going into code foreclosure. But I also liked in the different examples they gave, I think there was a real estate component to it where they have someone that's actually like, I don't know if we necessarily have used that approach for, affordable housing or addressing homelessness. Usually we put out applications, we look for developers, but I don't know that we've ever had that, a real estate professional that's going out finding suitable properties for this. So that may be a component to consider.
Yeah, I do think that that would be a helpful component. And we saw a few of the funders in those examples that required developers as part of those applicant teams. So that's always a possibility. If we do find that there's value in that, we could require it as well.
Could we use these funds to hire someone like a real estate expert to go out and find property or negotiate those kinds of things?
My understanding is that these funds couldn't go directly to like contracting a real estate agent or anything like that. That would have to be paid for with something probably a little bit more flexible than these funds. But certainly that's a need that could work in partnership with these funds.
It might be eligible under ARPA though.
Right.
Like if we look at utilizing, consolidated ARPA funds or a portion thereof from each jurisdiction toward it, maybe that's a component that goes along with it.
I mean, though ultimately, if we found someone that was an expert in that, wouldn't they ultimately, I mean, if something's purchased, they're ultimately going to get a commission. That's the way they'd get paid. It's finding the right person who has the expertise to get looking for what we want, and for them to know they get compensated when purchases happen. Just like, I mean, that happens in the commercial world, the residential world. That's how they make their compensation. There are consultants out there that get paid to do some work on that, but it's possible to find the right expertise in somebody who really understands the local market, and then they get compensated when stuff gets purchased.
I think there's one other thing Kaylee mentioned to me in chat yesterday when she was finishing up this presentation. I'd like her to mention too, that was a part of the success in I think it was California, Kaylee, so correct me, that had to do with zoning laws. And I think that's important for our government folks to understand as well.
Yeah, so the state statute in California that established their Home Key program said that any project that is approved through the Home Key process automatically fits within any zoning or planning guidelines. So that obviously was able to help expedite those projects tremendously. And it was a huge, regulatory burden off those developers' shoulders. So if we were able to do something like that on the county level or city level, I think that would be a tremendous help to these projects.
One thing I think Amy touched on about use of funds in anywhere, and we met with Chuck the other day, we were talking about this too, but really emphasizing a commitment or a need for a commitment from the different jurisdictions to tackle this, especially during this time of crisis, that we have to consider outside our boundaries overall, that we're not just looking at, what's being funded in my jurisdiction or your jurisdiction or where the people are coming from, but that especially with the land availability and so forth, that we're looking countywide and we have to find what's suitable and place people where we can.
For sure. Any other questions or comments from folks?
Okay, just a question. Kaylee, can you possibly provide that PowerPoint that you were working from? Unfortunately, my colleagues from the Housing and Community Development Department are not on here, and I think they really need to know some of this information that's been shared. And I apologize that I've been rather quiet because I just don't, can't feel comfortable speaking for that department. and those staff.
Teresa, you should have gotten it last night, and I did send it to Rob and Joshua and them as well.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. A huge thank you, Kaylee, to you for getting this together. I echo Councilmember Beckman's comment in the written comments. Excellent presentation, and appreciate you pulling together a variety of ideas, but also sort of distilling for all of us the funding, how it can be used, other ideas. This is a really succinct presentation, and I appreciate that. And anyone else that worked with you to get this together, the help to pull it together. This is very useful, I think, for all of us. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to now, we're a little bit behind schedule, but we'll try to catch up. Brian, we are going to take a look and review our data dashboard.
And Duggan, I think we can totally make up for it in the last discussion. So Brian, it's been a while since they've seen data, so take the time you need and we'll make up for it in the end.
Thanks, Amy.
All right, sounds good. Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go through, so this is the third quarter data. So from April 1st to June 30th, and then comparing it to the previous quarter, which would be the second quarter for the fiscal year. So for this dashboard, there are a couple major things that we have seen. The first one, and it's a relatively small section, but at the top on the very first page, it does show the number of people being served in the quarter. The big thing here is that we are still seeing a slight increase. During the pandemic, we've been seeing some decreases or not a lot of movement. We're still lower than we would normally be in like a normal quarter pre-pandemic, but we are still seeing increases. Most of those increases are coming from the literally homeless projects like shelter, street outreach, safe haven transitional housing, and rapid rehousing is also seeing increases. We've also seen increases in homeless prevention. The big thing there is that from the second to third quarter, it was an increase of 119 people, which isn't a huge number compared to the 6,000, but we only had 600 and some people served. So it's actually a pretty big increase being served in prevention itself. When we look at the demographics, we don't see a lot of shift. We're not seeing a lot of movement in, when you look at race, it's minor shifts here. We still know that the population that is being served is disproportionate to the general population of Pinellas County. And about 40% of those being served do identify as Black or African American, compared to the general population of Pinellas County. Those identifying as white are kind of in the mid 50%. So it's a very disproportionate representation compared to the county itself. When we look at Hispanic and Latinx, again, not a lot of shift there. We are lower than what we normally see in Pinellas County for the general population. And when we look at veterans, we still see a fair number of veterans, even though we have seen a slight decrease, but we are still right around 20% of those being served are veterans. For gender, again, not a lot of shift. Our demographics generally don't change a whole lot quarter to quarter or even year to year. We have some disproportionate representation with our demographics, but otherwise we don't usually see massive changes, especially for quarters. With age, we see some slight shifts, but again, nothing too major. Once we hit the kind of the 64 age range, it drops off pretty significantly. Pinellas County itself is a little different in what that age distribution looks like. So we don't see a lot of shift here, but we do see a fair number of children under the ages of 12 and under that are being served. It's close to 20% of the entire population being served during the 2 quarters. When we actually look at the performance and the metrics themselves, we see a lot of the same trends we have been seeing, but with length of stay for the first time really since the pandemic started, we've seen some actual decreases in length of stay. What we had been seeing quarter to quarter is that people were generally, if they were in shelter or safe haven or transitional housing, they were generally staying longer. We didn't have as many people in those projects, but those that were there were staying for longer periods of time. What we really see here is we actually see some slight decreases. They're relatively minor, but for shelter, it went from an average of 56 days per person to 53 days. For rapid rehousing, we also see a slight decrease of 17 days from quarter to quarter, and that's from enrollment to discharge from that project where they're no longer receiving services. Safe haven, again, we see a decrease of 24 days for the average, and transitional housing is down 8. And so those are, I mean, potentially, good signs, just because we're not seeing that length of time just continue to increase. This is the average, so we do have people that may be staying longer. We have people that are going to be staying, for less time total. But again, those are some positives because we're not seeing that number continue to creep up. For permanent housing and permanent supportive housing, we see those numbers continue to increase, and that's generally going to be the trend because those tend to be projects where people are staying for a long period of time. So we do expect to see, unless units are turning over and new people are enrolling, those numbers will just kind of continue to climb throughout the project's operation. Now, we were talking about some of the changes in length of stay, but one of the things that we're still seeing as a major impact is how long is it taking people to get housed through rapid rehousing? And so this is really something where we have seen this number continue to increase. So from just the first 3 months of this calendar year to the last 3 months, we have seen that the average increase by 10 days. We're up to 95-day average from enrollment into rapid rehousing to placement into housing, whether that's an apartment, home, whatever that permanent housing is. It's taking a little over 3 months to go from enrollment to housing. Previously, it was 85 days, and even before the pandemic, we were in kind of the mid 50s, even low 60s. So this is a pretty significant increase. And as we look at data, this ends June 30th. As we've looked at data even beyond that, that number has continued to increase some. Now, there are a number of factors that come into play here. Could be people are enrolling with less income, or they aren't able to find a unit in the area they need for their job. There are challenges there, but this also is kind of indicating where we are in terms of the housing market and the ability to get people housed quickly. And as we have people getting housed, we can see this number move around because this is only including those that actually have been housed. So if we have a pool of clients enrolled in rapid rehousing for 4 or 5 months that haven't been housed yet, when they do get housed, we will see this increase. So this can fluctuate pretty quickly, but what we have seen is a consistent trend where this number continues to increase quarter after quarter. When we look at exits to permanent housing, we're seeing again some good performance from some of the project types. Homeless prevention is doing a great job in the mid 90% to get people, to remain in housing and keep them stably housed when they leave that project. Other programs, we're seeing some changes there. We don't see a lot of exits to permanent housing from emergency shelter, but we generally don't expect that. It's not always the intent, it's to keep them off the streets, give them somewhere to stay. We'd like to see that go up, but this is where we tend to see that project type. Rapid rehousing, we actually see a slight decrease. We go from 75.5% to 73.5%. Not a major change, but still these mid 70s is not the range we really want to see rapid rehousing. We'd like to see that in the 80% range. Obviously, we'd like to see it a lot higher, but we know there can be things that do impact someone's ability to be stably housed. So generally, the national target for rapid rehousing benchmarks would be about 85%. So we are a little lower than that. Safe haven. Now, I'll say with safe haven, this is a very, very small population. So the fluctuations here from 55% to 42% could be a matter of 3 or 4 people in a quarter. It's a pretty small number of beds and a pretty small pool of clients. So we can see some pretty pretty big fluctuations here, even if it's only a change of a client or two from quarter to quarter. But these are also people that have high needs. So we'd like to see these people getting connected to, ideally permanent supportive housing or somewhere like that. So obviously they have challenges to getting stably housed, and we'd like to see that happen at a higher rate than what we're seeing right now. Street outreach, again, it's not really the intent of street outreach to get people placed directly into permanent housing, but it's part of that process. So I would still say that 20% and 16% still a really good outcome for that, because normally we don't see the numbers quite that high, just because there are often a lot of steps that that person goes through, getting into shelter, getting into rapid rehousing before they go there. So street outreach doesn't necessarily stay engaged that entire time. Transitional housing, we do see some increases there, and that's good because we're also seeing some of the providers that had some reduced capacity due to social distancing had been taking more people. We'd seen some slight increases in how many are being served in transitional housing. So that increase in percentage is a good sign. For permanent housing, we don't see too many people in those projects. We have very few that count. So again, not a lot of shift there where it's going to be significant populations. And then for PSH, again, we see really good outcomes here because these are people that are generally staying in those projects for a long time. And then the ones that do tend to go to permanent housing. After that, we don't see a lot of shift with income, not a lot of changes. Those increasing income generally are decreasing from quarter to quarter, but otherwise not a lot of movement here. And that has been the trend. We don't necessarily see big jumps in gains in income for the entire COC. When we look at our high needs clients, again, really no major shifts from quarter to quarter. But what we can see with some of it is we have a fair number of people entering all of the project types without any income. 55% for emergency shelter, in the mid 30s or low 30s for pretty much every other project type, if not higher. And obviously that's a big issue and a big barrier to getting someone stably housed. If they don't have any income, that can make things very difficult. We see some very different numbers for entering off the street for the different project types. But generally they are all kind of about 25% of clients are entering directly off the streets, a little higher for street outreach and emergency shelter. And then when we look at those entering with more than one disability, again, it's a pretty low percentage of each project type's entries, but these are also probably clients that need more assistance to become stably housed. So when we look at something like Safe Haven, where we expect them to serve those clients, that makes sense. But when we see some of the others, like transitional housing, shelter, that could be an issue because that could be a barrier to getting some of those people stably housed. When we get to our VI SPDATs, again, not a lot of shift here. These are the averages. So for some projects, we have a range of people entering. So we may have some very high scores and some very low scores. But the key things here are, if you look at street outreach, their VIF SPDATs are in the 7.5 and 8.5 range between the two quarters, which is pretty high. When we look at rapid rehousing, they're really right in the rapid rehousing range, which is good, but we know that we have people with higher acuity. Safe Haven, we expect to see that to be a little higher, and emergency shelter also kind of fluctuates. So again, not a lot of movement between the two quarters. We kind of expect to see these scores for the different projects. And to kind of wrap this up quickly, for returns to homelessness, again, between the two quarters, we do not see a lot of movement. Again, for Safe Haven, the numbers look pretty high, but this is, again, a very low population, and then this is only looking at exits to permanent housing and those returns. So we're really looking at a maximum of like a pool of 10 clients really each quarter with a couple returns. So again, very low numbers when we actually look at the numbers behind the percentages. But otherwise, everything kind of falls into the range that we normally see for projects. When we look at like rapid rehousing, we're at 10.5 and 8%. That's really pretty good for what we want to see with that. And then for some of the others, transitional housing, we're at about 23%, which is kind of high, but transitional housing is also not a huge pool itself. So it's a little bigger than Safe Haven. So we'll see some fluctuation there. But otherwise, most of the projects are pretty low, which is what we would like to see. And that is it for that. If anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
So Brian, Arrow has a question for you in the chat. And I apologize, I'm trying to get there here. She's asking if street outreach, she makes a statement that street outreach is higher than emergency shelters for exit to permanent housing and an increase into housing. Is that because of the difference in total volume of clients served?
Right. So for street outreach and shelter, it is going to come down a lot to the volume. With emergency shelter, even with some of the reductions for the pandemic and social distancing, we still have hundreds of beds in emergency shelter, and so we have, and we have issues with shelter. And this is a national thing where people will disappear from shelter and they don't know where they go. So of course, they could self-resolve. They could go somewhere that would be like staying with a family or friend. That could be a permanent exit. But if they don't actually tell the shelter has no way to capture that. So there are some things where it's just clients disappearing. But yeah, the volume really comes in because we're usually looking at a couple hundred clients with street outreach over a year versus several thousand from emergency shelter. So volume is a pretty significant part of that difference.
And then Teresa has a question. She'd like to know, does the data track the length of time that the financial support through rapid rehousing is lasting before the clients are self-sufficient?
So with rapid rehousing, with this set of data, what we're looking at is the total length of stay and then the time to housing. And then, after that, it's not really a part of this data. It is something we can look at as far as, they were housed on March 1st and received assistance for 6 months after that. And then, would be self-sufficient or ideally is self-sufficient after that. So it's not directly in this data, but it is something that we could look at.
And I don't believe that the recidivism report is part of today's presentation, Teresa.
I have a question too. So I know we haven't gotten to that part yet, but the statement of need that Amy sent out, there's a large volume of people waiting to get access to the programs. So they're not included in any of this data. Do we know if VI SPDATs have at least been done on those groups yet, or not even that?
So Arrow, those groups are on the coordinated entry list, and they were sectioned off by intervention needed based on their acuity score. So 0 to 3, we've presented it that way before, but I felt like if somebody else picked this up, they don't know what 0 to 3 means, right? So I just changed the language to what would make sense to somebody not in our system, but they are all VI SPDATed that are in that first chart you see in the statement of need that was sent last night. I do need to make clear though, veterans are not in that chart. That's a whole different system. So that is just individuals and families in our coordinated entry list.
Can I ask a question about the one of the earlier pages on the overview, gender and age of people served? I'm thinking if I go on the website, I can pull this data, but you've got under the age groups, you just have percentages, and I'd like to know the exact numbers because you've got kind of the exact numbers of male, female, gender nonconforming, all that. But it would be nice, just to be able to have an impactful statement of how many people under the age of 18 are in the system or being served. That's all.
So on the website, on the dashboard itself, part of the reason that the numbers aren't there is just a space issue.
Yeah.
But if you go onto the website and you mouse over each section, it'll actually give you the counts there.
Okay.
So
Fantastic.
all of that information is presented on it. It's just for space, it tends to make it illegible if you try to include too much. So the numbers are there, the counts are there for all of the different sections.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any other questions for Brian on the data dashboard? Anything else folks want to know? All right, and I believe I I made it available in the chat too. The live dashboard is available on the HLA website for this time period, and you can. It's Brian showed a little bit of it, and we've looked at it before, but you can go poke around. You can look at different intervention types, and then all of the data and information. And to Teresa's question about returns to homelessness, there is a tab at the top for returns, and you can look at returns, and then you could filter them by project type if you'd like to. You could look at age, any of the demographic information, and then within project types too, you can look at the returns and performance by program provider as well. So the dashboard online is pretty robust and contains a ton of information. I continue to be very appreciative to the entire team that works on getting the data to us, getting the dashboard done. Thank you very much for helping us walk through some of the important pieces of this morning, Brian. It's much appreciated. Does anyone have, before we move on to the next item, I just want to ask one more time if anybody has additional questions about the data for the third quarter.
Duggan, I appreciate what you just said about the dashboard. And the reason I asked about recidivism is because some of us that are funders specifically related to rapid rehousing, we get additional information related to recidivism specifically for our program. It's pretty interesting data that shows not just the statistics like you've been provided, but the lengths of time sometimes for one case that comes to mind for me is one where after the family was graduated out of the RH program, within 3 days, they were back in homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some interest in, that was one of the reasons why I asked about, does it document, does the data reflect the amount of time that's spent in terms of financial assistance for those that are housed through rapid rehousing, as well as the fact that sometimes that it's not just an average of the 6 months that most of these the local programs typically provide for, but particularly since COVID has been in our community, it's been more like double that amount of time, sometimes 15 months of time. And once the financial assistance has gone away, in some instances, and some would say they're outliers, they're back in homelessness again. So that was why I raised those kinds of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. And to Teresa's point, is there a place that we capture that? That is not the returns. You're exactly right, Teresa. The returns are on there, but those are averages. It does not indicate the length of time. And that is an interesting point. The length of time that someone is receiving rapid rehousing assistance before they're self-sufficient, which also is sort of telling over time. You know, if it's being longer and longer average periods of time, that could be reflective of our housing, you know, affordability challenges here. But is there a repository for that type of information that's more detailed, to Teresa's point?
So we don't have something like that right now, but obviously it's something we can look into. We do have, of course, you know, the data from HMIS, and with what Teresa was mentioning, like we do look at that some with a few projects, but you know, we could look at, so the data for how long it takes them to return, that is something that we do have. It's just not included in this. So we could look at breaking out some of that information to show, because obviously there's a very different you know, understanding for someone that returns within a month versus someone that's returning 18 months, 18 months later, it could be a very different rationale and a very different understanding of what's going on in that case. So it is definitely something we could look at. I don't know if we'd be able to incorporate it into this in a way that would, you know, make it understandable, but it is something we could look at, you know, pulling together
And maybe even on a periodic basis to look at that if it's not something that we can include in the dashboard, because I could see that that might be difficult. But those 2 points would be interesting. The returns to homelessness within a period of time is what we're looking at. But it would be interesting to know where people fall sort of on a spectrum. Is it within 3 months of a program ending? Is it 9 months, 12 months? Because I think within the returns, we're looking at within a 24-month period, correct? So it could be the vast majority of people who return to homelessness, it's a short time after assistance or a program ends. That might give us some clue to additional assistance that might be needed. And then I think the other piece, and I don't know how difficult this is to pull this information out, is the length of time someone's in the program and receiving financial assistance. Just to look at the averages of that might be helpful to Teresa's point.
Yes, I can definitely look into that.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you, Teresa, for being very clear about that. I do think those are two important data points that maybe we don't see them every time, but if we could dig into the data every now and then, they might give us some clues as to ways to provide better support or look at the design of existing programs. And sort of it's another clue probably of the overall global issues happening in our housing, in housing. All right, anyone else have any other questions on the data this morning? All right, so let's look at Avery. I think you're gonna provide some, and it's in the packet too, talking about performance measures from the Data and System Performance Committee.
Yes, I want to bring you all up to date on our last work group meeting that we had between Data System Performance and funders. That meeting was held on June 14th, and we came up with some final resolutions and some recommendations for Funders Council out of that meeting. And the first one was that Brian is going to create a dashboard training for this group and whomever else would like to learn from it. He's going to make it very simple. He will record it, and it'll also have a very short tutorial for those that want the paper to look at too. And he's going to go ahead and make sure that he does one live, and then he'll record that for Prosperity, and it will be on the Talent. So anyone who wants to learn how to maneuver through the dashboard can do so. They can learn that. So that was a big takeaway that we have. So look for that coming up. The next thing that we talked about was obviously the benchmarking, and because that's what you're looking for. So it was determined that ultimately there are 3 benchmarks that are most important to the funders, and that was the exits, the returns, and income. And we are strongly recommending from Data System Performance that you all adopt these by the project type. That's because these are established by Data System Performance, and we do change them based on what's going on in the system at the time. But this is based on what the projects are actually doing. How are they doing now? And then what kind of benchmark can we set for them to achieve? So that's where these come from. I am presenting to you right now an example of the rapid rehousing, because that's a majority of the funding right now in the COC. So when we look at rapid rehousing benchmarks for the continuum of care, specifically at rapid rehousing, we're looking to make sure that at least 85% of those housed remain in permanent housing at program exit. At least 15% will increase earned income at exit or during that reporting period. 20% will maintain earned during the reporting period or exit. 20% will increase unearned, and 15% will maintain unearned. There's a reason why we split these out this year. This is more accurate to what goes to HUD. And this gives us a true accounting for income and what's happening within that client's life. That's why we split out the maintained and the increase along with the earned and unearned. You notice the red. We changed those from the original that we proposed to the COC almost 2 years ago because rapid rehousing was doing better. So we made sure that we had to increase that.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because I know when this goes to the COC board, this question was asked the last time we looked at benchmarks. Why would we ever set a benchmark lower than we're currently achieving? And especially unearned income that, we have the ability to really assist people with. And in our statement of need and in the last funders meeting, we had a significant amount of conversation around the need to connect people to these supportive services. And we know that prevents people from becoming homeless. And so I just wanted to, click on this for a minute.
Thank you, Amy. The reason why this is what it is right now is this is reflective of what the projects are experiencing through COVID. So therefore, DSP wanted to project some lower because it is taking longer to process people's paperwork. It's just taking longer right now and it's harder. So what you're seeing off to the side of the current stats, this was pre-COVID that we're looking at when we look at these current statistics. So the red lines are taking COVID into consideration. These have not come before the board yet because we're going to do an update with DSP to make sure that they still make sense.
Okay, thank you.
So if we find out from our next benchmark that these are too low, even in COVID, they will go back. They're going to be increased. But for rapid rehousing, these were lower. And that was based on project feedback. So for the rapid rehousing projects, within 6 months of exit, no more than 10% will return. And then after 2 years of exit, no more than 20% will return. So that is a sample of the 3 that were important to Funders Council, specifically for rapid rehousing. And we do have it broken out by each project type for you. We just want to get through September to give you the final numbers that we're going to take to the board. Are there any questions or anybody wants to see any other of the project benchmarks? Hey, thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, that was quick. Thank you. The next item on the calendar or the agenda for today is discussions on gaps and looking at the updated funding chart. I believe that Susan's going to talk about this, and I think Arrow is as well. Let's see.
Susan, do you want to go first?
Sure. We, part of your agenda, and as Kaylee had indicated, is the updated funding chart that is arranged by the end date and the type of funding source. I think it makes sense as we navigate through this that I'll reach out to you all to update this monthly just to keep track of where all the funding's going. Amy did send you all yesterday, last night, a really very comprehensive statement of need. We held a special meeting on July 16th and talked a lot about unmet needs and gaps in services. So this is a very detailed document that kind of looks at the numbers seeking shelter, number of homeless families, what type of intervention, prevention, diversion, all of that's laid out. And I think Arrow and I really wanted to spend most of this time discussing both immediate needs to deal with the crisis, and then longer term needs of sustainability as we move through this. And again, meeting collectively on this is going to be critical. And I know, Errol, you had a couple of things you wanted to say too, but most of this is going to be generated by the committee.
Susan, can I add one thing on that? In Kaylee's preparation for presenting, the goal of us presenting on ESGCV today and CDBGCV is so that this entire group is having that big picture view of everything that's funded in our community and what those gaps are. And the only thing we have to use based on that, some municipalities back up to their council members is easier to access and view than others. It's all there, but everybody does it differently. And so it's hard to interpret some of it, I'll say. So the information we have on that funding chart you have provided to us, and we found quite a few things in our internal discussions that isn't on that chart that is funded, like legal mediation services. And so, you know, I had to update the presentation based on that with Kaylee, because she originally was going just by the chart. The other thing I want to kind of mention, because I've brought it to your attention many times in this meeting, but I want to continue to raise this concern. Again, you know, we're only at 6% of spending in some areas. We tried to take that funding chart and make it a dashboard where it was red, yellow, or green based on the amount of time passed and the amount of money that should have been spent. But we struggled with finding start dates for some contracts. So I wanted to mention that because I do think you having some kind of dashboard would be helpful to you to know, you know, this one should be spending a little bit more or that kind of thing. Maybe you do those things internally and can help us with that. But that was something we struggled with. So that's why we provided it 2 different ways. By end date, we felt like that was important to look at. And then again, kind of by type. The other thing we've talked about in this meeting that I want to highlight is there's a lot of those that were awarded a long time ago that were at 0. And I started some advocacy campaigns with different funders to say, this is unacceptable. People need help now. And come to find out they weren't actually at 0, even though that's what staff were giving us as the update. They had bills in. I know in our case, there were 8 months worth of bills unpaid and processed. And that was true for many other providers as well. So it's not helpful for us to have this conversation with you to be reporting there's 0 spent if there's bills in that are unpaid. Because again, the point of this is to have that big picture view so that we can have those conversations about, you know, we need this one to spend more now. This will help, you know, before the eviction moratorium lifts. That's now today. But I just wanted to kind of highlight those things before we got into the discussion so that we can continue to refine the resources we're providing to you so that this group can make the best decisions possible for our community.
So, Errol, did you want to add to anything before we just open it up to the general group for discussion?
Sure. So, you know, Amy had sent out that statement of need, and this was based off of, started with the 2-hour session we had back in July, identifying needs for trying to move the needle as well with the homeless system, as well as homeless diversion and prevention, so that hopefully we come out as a stronger community on the other side of this pandemic than we even went in. We're kind of at the height of the dark days, it seems like right now. So I think as you read through the statement of need, you'll notice there's items that are needing to be addressed on that crisis level to really, especially when we talk about, you know, we see the numbers of kids that are in shelters or street homeless right now in our community and so forth. So there's those needs, as well as planning for those longer term fixes to our affordable housing crisis. and that was one of the key points, I think, too, that we can add into the statement of need is about really emphasizing, especially to local governments, that, you know, focusing efforts on expanding affordable housing units in their community. The other one, though, I think, Amy, you just touched on something that we could potentially add to the statement of need as well, is streamlining any regulatory processes for affordable housing right now being critical, and then also ensuring that there's an expedited process to get these reimbursements done to the nonprofits that are on the front line. So I would recommend we add those two, because that's a valuable point. I think April put in the notes that she's waiting for $750,000 in reimbursements right now. So just making sure that local governments are providing that support and expediting some of those as part of that emergency service response. But I think beyond that, I'd love to, you know, for us to get some feedback on the statement of needs so that we can finalize it. I think it's very timely, especially with the moratorium lifting today, that we be able to provide this information to elected officials, to the newspapers, to our hospitals, to private sector, you know, anyone that we can to help get the word out about the needs right now.
With that, we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you. Any comments, questions about the updated chart, spending, and what's going on today? All right.
Kathleen has a question.
Oh, go ahead, please.
So I read the documents, you know, last night. The first one we had kind of seen a little bit before, but the second longer statement of need was pretty sobering. I sent it to my peers last night because we have a work session on Monday, just to keep them informed as I advocate for more spending. And I was recently named in the spring, I guess, second vice president of the Suncoast League of Cities. And I thought I would share it with those smaller municipalities that don't contribute right now and see if we can get them to step up just a little bit. And I don't know how they could ignore all of that information. We all live in the same county. So, you know, we kind of talked a little before the meeting, those of us that were on here early. So Amy's going to finalize, and then there's an okay to send things out. Amy, on that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do a proof of it today and make a few changes based on any conversation today and get it back out. And then we can continue to update it based on, you know, feedback that people give in the next couple of weeks.
And Amy, I read through the statement of need this morning, and I think it's excellent. And I think a very good way to explain to people sort of the status of things as they are right now, and the possibility is that I think they're just going to become even more urgent. The only suggestion I would have is at the very top of it, where you're talking about the crisis response system, and you're talking about the numbers in shelter and the numbers unsheltered. To me, they're pretty stark. Maybe you want to pull those out as bullets, so people see right up front that this is what's happening right now, especially that unsheltered number. I think is huge, and we're going to see that grow, unfortunately. That was my only suggestion. The rest of it I think is great, gives the context and information, talks about the, you know, ways that some of these issues could be addressed. So thank you for that.
And I mean, to me, it does feel like the wage discussion and the affordable housing, there's lots more data and things that can go there. So if folks have ideas around that, I thought about putting some Alice report information in there. But, you know, feel free. The goal was to, you know, have us all speaking in one voice, and hopefully it'll be helpful, and, you know, we can get some traction from news and other outlets around that.
I think a big question that's going to come back to, and that this is why it's critical to make sure we have a unified answer on this, is if there's that much money in our system right now, what are those blockages to getting the money out? So I think we really need to make that clear too, that the front end services are just getting inundated right now. And then I think April mentioned as well, she said, aside from some staffing shortages, they're really getting hit too with either COVID quarantine or COVID positive cases with staffing as well. So, and then I think we've touched on too, just the mental health impacts of the frontline workers too, is really taking a toll on ability to continue providing that volume of service right now.
Well,
Amy. Oh, wait.
Okay, well, to follow up with that, Arrow, so would the unified response be, we think money should be spent first and foremost to hire qualified staff to process and deal with the blockages of the funding that's sitting there? Is that what we're saying as a group? And then do we hire these people for just a few years and then they don't stay on? What does that look like?
So it sounded like there was a couple different components to it. I think Amy had mentioned that ESG CV funds allow for hazard pay. So if we can get some information out about that too. I don't know about CDBG CV, but that might be something that we need to look at for a bunch of our contracts, if we need to look at doing amendments, if there's funding available to cover the extra cost, but to allow, especially with it being difficult to find qualified people for these roles, it's not like you can just take someone that has no social service background, for example, and throw them in some of these roles, but that the wages are high enough that they can be competitive and fill them with qualified people, but also that they're being compensated for this frontline work that they're doing right now.
Yep. Well, and I think with capacity, I mean, the hazard pay is one thing, which I'd be all for, but you can only process so many people in a day. I mean, my gosh, I'm sure they're, working overtime now, but okay. That's all I had. Thanks.
Well, I can tell you from, we go to weekly meetings with DCF and other COCs across the state. And this is something every community is experiencing as far as staff burnout and, lack of capacity, and all of that is just something that everyone is feeling right now. So
I know Teresa had her hand up, but I wanted to acknowledge, government staff as well, right? So social service workers from providers are feeling this way. It is a significant challenge for our governments to push this money out as well. They were not provided administrative dollars to do that. That feedback has been provided to the League of Cities and others. But that is a challenge as well that I think we have to continue to talk about. And, I think many people were already at capacity, and every contract for CDBG requires an attorney, and there's finance people to push out those checks and all of those things. And so I keep trying to push that in my own area. And I think as policymakers, that has to be a part of the conversation as well.
And one other component I think with that we're seeing is, when we have a hurricane here, most people in local governments, their role switched to emergency response in some way, but that emergency response system is not set up to handle economic crises like we're in right now. And so I think there's also that we're doing all of our same types of work and these same projects and the same, whatever. And then also there's this whole crisis thing going on that we're also dealing with too. So I think that's been tricky and might be a good thing for, electeds to understand too, is staff are operating in crisis response systems right now.
that's an excellent point, Arrow.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments this morning about the funding chart? Comments about, I think most of us have now seen this statement of need And anything else for our meeting this morning for those purposes? All right.
Duncan, can I
go
just
ahead.
ask Joe a question real quick? Joe, can you address a little bit about the ERA2 funds that and some of the supplemental support services that might be attached to that? You know, that you all mentioned that yesterday, so might be helpful for this group to hear.
Yes, we're currently, as we speak, working to update the policies and procedures to allow those flexibilities that we're seeing in the guidance that's coming down from Treasury and the White House into the program, so that we can expand the ability to get the ERA 1 and 2 funds out the door. We have looked into, and once we get that done, because we know the importance of getting the funds out there, then we're going to go back and step back and look at those other supplemental places that we need, again, based on needs and whatnot, to be able to use those funds through the ERA2. So that is still ongoing. Our primary focus over the last week or two has been getting the policies and procedures and everything updated to get those ERA2 funds started to be expended and use those flexibilities that we have. Then we will move into those additional other needs that are eligible under ERA2 and start looking at getting those needs addressed.
Thank you. All right, anything else this morning from folks? All right, and I just wanted to let folks know, I know we saw last night the eviction moratorium being lifted. I think many of us didn't think it was going to last that long anyway. So certainly issues are more critical. We're in the process, the foundation is making an allocation to both Gulf Coast Legal and Community Law Program. They're not huge, to pay into the rental, to the court registry for rental payments in an effort to at least without the assistance of the moratorium, to get cases heard in court or by time for payments to be made for rent assistance. And those should go out by electronic payment this morning, or they've already gone out, so they can get that in process. Our next meeting of the Funders Council is scheduled for October 22nd, I believe. And to that end, we had a rank and review meeting on Monday of this week, doing part of the rank and review for what is now the NOFO process, and our annual application for federal funding for our homeless services system. And considering that it looks like we are going to do everything to maximize the score, our local score in that proposal, one way that we can do that and gain bonus points is creating a project that will bring together, I think it's housing, well, in short form, housing and healthcare, and have a special project that could gain us bonus points, and then the opportunity again to apply for a DV bonus project. We discussed that on Monday, and I think we're going to be getting RFPs out shortly. So to that end, to keep the timing moving forward, I think we're going to look at the day of the Funders Council meeting on October 22nd being our rank and review, the second piece of the rank and review process for our public rank and review deliberations. So I think, and Amy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we're looking at Funders Council being limited to an hour that day, 9 to 10, and most likely, if need be, doing it virtually, if we don't need to take any votes, or if there are not major items for the agenda, we might cancel that meeting in favor of moving up the rank and review meeting to earlier if needed. So I just ask folks to pay attention to email and scheduling. We're going to leave it on the calendar for a moment, but it's likely that it would be, if it takes place, it'll be a 1-hour meeting, an abbreviated meeting for us that day, and most likely virtual.
You're right on that, Duggan. And I do want to mention, while we have funders in the room, something Avery and I were going through the NOFO. That's going to take a while to get used to. You noticed in the statement of need, and you discussed it in your last meeting, that dispatchable street outreach is still a need for our community. Health and Human Services funds jurisdictional street outreach. We will lose points on the NOFO as a community because we do not have street outreach across our entire continuum of care. And so I wanted to highlight that as a need for our community moving forward, that, you know, we don't have a way to answer how somewhere like Palm Harbor gets covered, or something that is not attached to police. And that will be something we are docked on for the upcoming competition.
Amy, has that been communicated? Because I'm not certain, and I see the staff from the county that.
Clark's on, and Teresa, it was just discovered yesterday or the day before. So I have not communicated that to Karen yet, but I mean, Karen is committed that we need dispatchable street outreach, but that is not something that she has in the Health and Human Services budget to do. And so that's why I bring it up here.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Anything else for us this morning before we adjourn? All right, doesn't sound like it. So thank you everybody for being with us today. And thank you to those who provided great information and presentations. Again, just watch your email for any updates for our next meeting in October. And we'll see everybody soon. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.